so excited to be joined by Sarah Broom today, author of The Yellow House. Actually, I should say National Book Award winner, Sarah Broom. Congratulations.
So much. It's such an honor to be here with you.
Oh, thank you. Um, I was just remarking that in like revisiting this your book for our conversation, I was just like blown away like all over again by your prose. So I definitely want to get into that. Um, but before we do that, I kind of just wanted to talk about this book as, as a memoir, as a deeply personal piece of writing that you were kind enough to share with the world. Um, and, one of the things I was thinking about is just um, like, how does one, of course, I have my notes, like they're handwritten instead of on the computer. So if I look down, that's why. Um, but how did you sort of consider ethics, when you started working on this project, the ethics of writing a memoir, and dealing with, familial secrets and shame and maybe things that had sort of been left, where, folks might have preferred to just sort of leave sleeping dogs, just let them lie.
Yeah. Well, that's such an interesting question. And, it's interesting because I kind of grew up, as it were, as a writer uh, in the newspaper world. And I found myself quite routinely, appearing in someone's life and trying to get to know the story of how a certain thing came to be or how they were wronged or how, in some instances I'd show up on a murder scene, right, where a parent had only recently lost their child, you know and have to sort of get a story in that particular moment. And so that, I think, practice, that work of what it means to be adjacent to a human being, and have access, right, to their
Mhm.
personal life and their personal story has been something I've contended with for a very long time. Of course, when we move that to my own family and my own self, I think the question for me was, A, what's the work I'm attempting to do? And how do I make, in terms of structure, a boat, as it were, that can kind of contain this world I'm building? Because to lay this all out, to put this all on the line, requires a kind of real consciousness and studiousness about how the thing is built and communicated in the first place. So that actually lent me ideas about structure. So, for instance, it felt humane to me that the people I was talking about, which also included myself, would be presented in full context with all of their historical bearing. That we wouldn't sort of appear mid-story, mid-sentence, that I would say to the reader, look, to get to where I want to take you, I have to tell you a bunch of other things that make this story, that frame this story, as it were. And then in the reporting itself, which was really difficult for me, you can imagine sitting down with your mother or with your aunt and just asking them over the course of a year the most intimate things you can imagine, in search of a kind of detail that would perhaps humanize them, you know, illuminate them so that they're not sort of easily boiled down, right? And that's why I needed the reporting. That's why I needed the detail, because in fact, for me, the detail broke them out of a kind of trope we often see, especially when it comes to Black families, Black women, and people of color, right? And so the deal was, I will come with my recorder that you will see at all times, and I will be interviewing you. And so, and then later on, people would forget that they had told me these things that I then wanted to use. And I'd call them up and say, "Hey, Daryl, do you remember telling me about hiding under my bed?" He'd say, "Oh my God, I said that." And I would say, "Listen, this is why I want to use this detail, because I'm trying to tell a story about how this house became a place with no walls for me, where there was no outside and no inside, where I was persistently vulnerable, right, in relation to it. Do you think I could use this story?" And he'd say either yes or no. In this case, yes. So I think I had multi-pronged processes. And for me, the work itself of the recorder, of the detail, of the accuracy, of the sort of granularity of the process was the ethical approach.
That's like so interesting to me, because you know as I was reading your book, um, I find just so many similarities, not to the way I grew up, but to the way my father grew up. My grandparents were sharecroppers. He has 11 brothers and sisters. And so there was just a sort of like Southern familiarity that I like instantly kind of, could cling to and understand.
Mm-hmm.
Um, that said, um, I think part of what makes this book so affecting is that your family members come alive. They feel like real people. It feels so novelistic. I almost feel like I'm dropped into a Jesmyn Ward novel.
Mm-hmm.
um, and so then I got curious, because you're 40, is that right? Okay. So you've been a grown woman for some time now. And I was wondering, when and how did you begin to see your mother and your grandmother, and the women who came before you, um, as more than just the roles that they play in your life? Like the way that they were like before you were even a notion.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I feel like there's often, we have these boundaries that are created by those relationships, that are defined by a sort of like respect that we have for our elders. Um, and so I'm wondering, when did you start to see and think of them as women as opposed to sort of like, as these roles, and people who are these roles in your life, like mother or grandmother or great grandmother,
Mm-hmm.
um, and um, and how did you sort of process that?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think there's something having to do with being the youngest of so many that creates in you a kind of very severe response and attention to positioning, right? And I always remember being in this position of sort of looking almost as if at a distance toward my siblings and saying, "Oh, okay, that's the this one, and that's the that one, and this one is the divorce prone one." And that, it's like this way that you start to try, I think, to put together the world. And because my family was so spread over decades, with brothers who were born in the 50s and the 60s and sisters, all over the map, I think there was more puzzling that I did from a very early age. My mother and I had, a pretty, I would say, typical Black mother and daughter relationship, in the sense that, it was clear that I was never her friend. You know, she was my mother, and that was very clear. Um, as a thinking person and as a journalist, I think that's what drew me, frankly, to the approach of being a kind of participant observer and collecting the oral histories of my family in the first place, because I thought it would actually be a way for me to be in relation to them without this sort of false idea that I could be objective or journalistic, right? but that I could definitely be inside and do a form of ethnography. But the moment when I was able to think of my grandmother as a woman and my mother as a woman really came what after all of that happened. And I was sitting alone having transcribed all of these interviews. And I had, collections of evidence and papers and primary sources. And I remember very clearly being at a writing residency in Connecticut. And it was the time when I was writing about my grandmother and how hard it was to write about her because it was so hard to get beyond these things I knew. And I remember just opening my notebook, or I hand wrote the whole first few drafts. I hand wrote three drafts of the book before I typed it. And I remember having this lined paper and just as if I were a novelist, looking at the facts, writing on one side of the page, just the facts, the description of this woman, what she looked like, what she wore, the sorts of things she said. And remember, this is the part where the reporting matters because, you might do, 3 weeks of reporting just to get this one granular detail about the color of her stockings on Easter, right? And I remember just culling all of those details and trying not to think of her as my grandmother and just saying, write about this woman, make a story from all these facts, and just give us a sense of her. And then I think thinking so much about Toni Morrison and how might I, writing nonfiction, inject these moments of magic, these moments where, and there were these clear moments with the food and how my grandmother was taught and how she taught her kids and the sort of mystery of her mother. And there were these sort of magical kind of narrative moments, right? That I looked for. Just the kind of, so that in the reader's mind, she became more alive. My mother was a lot more difficult, but her interviews were a binder about this size. And so I went through all of these interviews and I organized them. So my mother on childbearing, my mother on politics, my mother on education, my mother on New Orleans. And I would pull out all the more interesting things she'd say on each of these things. And then after I had that, I tried to make an arc of this woman from before I was around all the way through. The only difference being that I'm working with facts, obviously. I can't make anything up. And so and then if I was missing something, I'd maybe go back and interview her again and say, I just want to hone in on this particular moments of your life when the first 2 weeks when you were married to my father, right? Mm-hmm. Or like when you first moved into this house, what was that like? And then I'd go talk to the neighbor. My mother would tell me one thing, and then I'd go talk to the neighbor and say, do you remember my mother when they first moved in? And then I got this wonderful story from the neighbors who said, oh my God, I'll never forget her out there pushing the wheelbarrow. She was going back and forth, right? And so there were these ways, I think, that I was trying to come at who these people were from all angles, right? And also through the primary sources.
Wow. Do you have a copy of your book with you?
I have one in the next room. I could go over and get it.
Do you mind? Could I ask you to read a couple pages?
Okay.
I have a selection that if you don't mind.
Good. Okay.
So it's pages 109 to 110.
In the hardcover or paperback?
In the hardcover.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
It starts with, I am told that of the 12 children.
Okay. And where do you want me to stop?
At the end of the chapter, just at the end of 110.
Okay. I am told that of the 12 children, I was the one not taken to Daddy's funeral. Nobody wanted to be holding no baby. I stayed home with Joyce Davis, our neighbor on Wilson. Except for a reading from Mom's favorite psalm, I will lift up mine eyes to the hills, from whence cometh my help. The service was overrun by the Masons, whose Sir Knight, Ezekiel Frank, 32° most wise, took out a separate advertisement in the newspaper that called for members of Amity Axiom chapter of Rose Croix to attend funeral services of our late Sir Knight, Simon Broom. The attending men wore aprons and cloaks and wielded swords. They were wearing little skirts, Darrell says. A cross of two swords lay on top of the coffin. As part of the ritual, they turned off the lights. One of the members rang a bell and intoned my father's name. Simon, 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 they called. Arise, Simon. Just then the swords fell, startling Karen, who, horrified at the thought that Daddy might awaken, rise up and walk again, screamed at the top of her voice, betraying everyone's fright. The whole church jumped. Then quiet blew through the sanctuary. The walls froze. Why are you walking on the backs of your shoes? Simon Jr. asked Lynette. Her feet were hurting. He lifted her up over the casket to peer down on her father, who, for the first time in her life, offered nothing back. Even though Daddy played in Doc Pauline's brass band, there was no jazz funeral. Doc Pauline wanted one, but Mom, overcome by the thought of yet another detail, said no. She regrets this now. I too wish she had said yes to this request, and have sometimes felt that the absence of that detail somehow disturbed my own personal narrative. It would have been nice, for instance, to tell the following story. I am rhythmic because I have come from musical lineage. My father was so great an artist that he was honored with a jazz funeral. Horse-drawn carriages moved through the streets of New Orleans. People danced behind. To be able to say, I have come from that. For the repast after the funeral, most of Dad's family met at Corinne's house, less than a mile away from the house on Wilson, where our immediate family gathered. All the big important people went to Corinne and them house. Already Mom harbored self-consciousness about her own home, and this only grew with my father's death, his absence illuminating the house's frailties. After my father died in the small bathroom, the room folded in on itself, its dark blue painted walls peeling, the tub transformed into a storage bin, the socket hanging from the wall with pieces of electrical tape showing, the sink collapsing. No one tried to fix it back up. The house becoming around this time, Ivory May's 13th and most unruly child.
My goodness. Thank you. Oh, I could just listen to you all day.
About that section. I was like, where did this come from?
So, you have these stories in which the through line is this house and what happens to it. But before your father ever comes along and after him, going up to, when the water comes, as you refer to Katrina. And like part of that is, I feel like it makes me wonder about like what the sort of like permanence is for Black people. Particularly, if so many of us have, when we're finally able to come up with the resources to buy a house, disproportionately, very often we are in parts of the country, parts of the state, the county, whatever, where we're more susceptible to environmental racism, right? Where, you basically live in this portion of East New Orleans that, in a lot of ways is invisible to people, and is part of this vulnerability. As you think about, you have come into, some renown. How do how does that shape how you, think about um, your own surroundings, because you are, we're talking from your house in New Orleans that was so beautifully photographed for apartment therapy. um, does it feel, do you have a sense of permanence around that house that you live in now?
I would say no. And maybe the thing that it's interesting because my grandmother was a little different from my mother in that it took her a lot longer to buy a home. She rented a lot of apartments. And even in those rented places, she was really obsessed with making it hers. And so that leads me to believe that there's actually something beyond the American version of home ownership that a lot of the Black women, particularly in my world, were actually looking for when they were thinking of making place and thinking of making home. And I think for my grandmother, who had all forms of feelings of being unmoored, right? Having been essentially abandoned by her own mother before kindergarten, right? Um, that she was actually seeking something really existential. And I think about that more. I actually think the result, the sum total result of me having written this book is that I'm 1,000 times more confused about what it is I actually feel when it comes to the concept of home. And for me, home is so much more a psychological and almost physiological condition and place, right? And I try to pay attention these days to the conditions that make a feeling of home for me. And, even with my mother, there was something she always understood, a kind of expectation she had that things wouldn't last, really, right? I mean, that's really what the ground was sinking on the day we moved in was meant to say. And I think this living in a kind of precariousness perpetually, right, is such a training for so many of us. That I guess, and I wonder how much I'm holding myself in a kind of suspended position where I don't let myself sink into the house, right? Because I know, oh, these things come and go. They're not, they don't always stay. They don't always last. So find the beauty in it while you can, right? While it's actually here. And I think, being a tropical kid, I feel like a very tropical human, Caribbean girl growing up in Louisiana, right? I think there is this sense that things are not going to be here forever. And I think it makes us fatalistic on some level down here at times, right? Because we're sort of like, well, this is why we're having fun because, we need to enjoy it while it lasts. So that's a long-winded way of saying my relationship, and I think I'll be writing about place and geography and a kind of wandering of the self and of the spirit forever. But I actually like that my ideas about all of this are more complicated now because of the initial work.
um I mean, obviously, just the the way that this conversation is happening is defined by, our current circumstances, that being, the pandemic that we are going through. And, part of that is an immense amount of destruction that it has brought with it, whether it is to, the 212,000 people who have died of COVID at this point, but also the sort of the way that reverberates out to their families and their extended families. Um, and you know something about loss and trauma. And so, what I want to ask you is, um, what do you think we can take from the life of the Yellow House? before and after the water, to use in writing and thinking, in a time of crisis, when it does feel like so much is shifting beneath our feet. Um, times when we do feel sort of existentially unmoored.
Mm. I mean, so that feels like a two-part question at minimum, but I'll say there's a kind of personal response I'll give, and then there's a work-related response I'll give. So the personal one is I think for me, it's ritual is very, very important. And there's not a single day that goes by that I don't go figure out what that new number is of people who have died from COVID and don't stop for a moment to light a candle, to do whatever, pause, to recognize, to accept, to let that sink in, as it were, right? So that it never becomes normal. And I think for me in my own work and for this book, I'm really interested in the underbellies of things. I'm really interested in all the stuff happening underneath the clamor, all the things we're so trained to look at. And I'm very interested in all the things we're not trained to look at. And I'm interested in trying to bring those things to the fore. And I think that the work is, for me, my work is an attempt to kind of layer and layer and layer and layer. And by doing that amount of layering, by saying, okay, I'm going to look at public policy, and I'm going to look at, city planning. I'm going to look at zoning stuff. I'm going to look at, what was happening in 1965 at the same time the city council was doing X, and see what kind of is in between the cracks of all of that layering, and see what these patterns might explain, or where they might lead us. And I know that, hearing myself say it, because I taught a class, a virtual class at the beginning of COVID, about, basically it was like how to use the archive. And I think people showed up to this class feeling that I would sort of say, okay, take out a picture and let's describe the picture. And they were stunned when class started, and there were all these ways of what I call complicating narrative, right? And I realized they were so not used to thinking in that way, right? They were just sort of not used to fact checking memory, and getting 4 versions of the one thing, and then finding also the evidence of it, and thinking about what the absence of evidence means, and looking at maps, and that people, especially who had been trained in memoir, just conceived of it as a thing you remember and write, for the most part. And I thought, who taught you where did this sort of originate, right? And so all of that to say, I think I actually don't find the thing that I did to be that, mind-boggling. I think what I did was pay specific attention to all of the aspects that make a world, that make a place, that make a street, and then think about them always in relation to this architecture of place, and try always to connect this singular house to all of those pieces over and over and over again, and see what it might show us, right? About the time, about history, about New Orleans, you know.
Um, so I'm so glad you mentioned that, this, the different sort of ways that writers are trained, really, in how we think. And particularly when it comes to memoirs, because memory is so fallible. And so, yeah, even the ones that we think are really clear, We can often trip ourselves up. Um, but so your work has this like beautiful lyricism, um, and dedication to visual detail. Um, and, you know, I almost, it's funny to me that you went to journalism school, because it feels so much like the work of someone who went through a creative writing program. um, and like, I don't mean that in the sort of like new journalism, like gay Talese way. It's not that either. Um, and so and maybe it's just your voice, but like I really want to know, like, just because I'm nosy, but also so maybe I can copy it. But like, how did you do it?
Yeah, that's interesting. You know, I have, for as long as I can remember, I've actually been someone who, even as a kid, I was a fiction crazy person. I loved made up things. I was myself making up things, making my little fiction books and stapling them together at home. And, but as an adult, it's interesting because I was always obsessed with people. I remember being at University of North Texas and getting, I was studying anthropology and journalism, and I was always on the newspaper staff, so I always wanted to go out and find the people. I did what they call the soft journalism stories, and I would go and do the features, on the cool, interesting people, and and I remember so well doing like National Student Exchange, just wanting to be in the world, being always obsessed with, what Martha Gellhorn, the journalist, calls new sky, and just going someplace and being lost and discovering. But I remember going to Berkeley and wanting so badly to go to Berkeley because I wanted to study with June Jordan, the poet and essayist. But mostly the poet, she was mostly a poet for me at that stage in my life. I was voracious and still am. I love the poets. I think the poets are my friends. And I'm a person who always loved poetry and was very interested in rhythm and how you say things and the detail that makes something come alive. And before I entered the Berkeley to study with June Jordan, I wanted to take her class, Poetry for the People. She died of breast cancer. And I took her class anyway. And I remember that the journalism students would make fun of me because I was spending so much time in this poetry class. Like, that's all I cared about. I didn't give a damn about what was happening. And I just sat there in all of these poets and with all of these poets, and I was learning to write a ghazal and learning to write a sonnet, and I remember writing a ghazal about my friend Elvin, you know, even back then, and the description and the funeral and the texture of him. And I think in my life personally, I'm somebody who seeks texture, and I
Mhm.
want to write, all that lyricism or whatever you want to call it, that for me is always in the revision. I'm such an elaborate reviser. I mean, I think part of it is because I actually worked as an editor once upon a time. So I'm really good at editing myself. I have no affinity. I'm not in love with anything I write. I'm a really harsh critic of myself. And I really know how to take notes. So I don't take notes ever literally. When someone gives me notes, I write to change I try to address the spirit of the note, So if a note is indicating to me lack of clarity, it's not convincing enough, it's not clear enough, they can't really see what I'm trying to do. Whatever the spirit of the note is what I try to address. And I think in that way, I force myself to take my drafts very, very far beyond mere tweaking. And I love the revision. I live for the revision. And it's in the revision where I start to be very careful about omissions. I start omitting a lot. I start thinking about how it's moving, the sound of it. And in this book, and I suspect all of my books will have many characters because I love making these people come alive. Anybody, I love making people come alive. But in this book, I had to take each of the characters and really make an arc for each of them. And some people had to recede to become minor characters. So, in other words, I treated it like a novel, except I was working with a mound of facts. But it was a very, what I would imagine a novelistic enterprise might look like, you know.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I've never written a novel.
I think you'd be good at it. I feel like there's a very sort of like Zora Neale Hurston quality to you,
That's a
that I
major
feel
compliment.
comes through. Do
And
you?
I just want to mention real quick the writer Gail Jones.
Oh,
I
mhm,
think, in terms of who my trainer may have been, quietly, a kind of woman whose work I just finished the book and read it again. There's a kind of realism in it that I really understand. You know, it's not it's not objectifying of the people within its world. The people live according to their own terms. And that is something that so matters to me, that people are allowed to live on their own terms, right? That they aren't judged by some register that has nothing to do with their life. And I
mhm,
think Gail Jones, just because you mentioned Zora, and so I wanted to mention
mhm,
someone I love as much as I love Zora, the way that Gail Jones has, and Black women writers and thinkers
mhm,
have taught me how to be a person who complicates stories. It's just
mhm.
something I can't ever
Yeah,
forget about.
I feel like there's a little bit of Lorraine in there too, and
Yeah.
that's especially because she started out as a journalist and then
Mhm.
um, and then went on to become a playwright. But that's I could go on like all day about stuff like that. But actually, like part of the reason why I bring up Zora is because I wanted to ask you, um, do you see yourself as a Southern writer? Um, what does that mean to you, that descriptor? Because it feels like even just beyond, the literary world, there has been, I'm hesitant to call it a renaissance, but this sort of blooming of the voices of Black Southern writers and women, and actively sort of embracing that identity as opposed to sort of like running away from it, because so often, Southernness is conflated with being, sort of unworldly, and you're this like ignorant hayseed. Um, and we are living in the time of Jesmyn Ward and Kizzy Lehman and Tracy McMillan Cottom, and but also in film, your own partner Mudbound, who adapted Mudbound for the screen, and also TV. We've got Queen Sugar and P Valley.
Mhm.
Um, what do you make of this? I suppose that is a
Well,
multi-part question. I'm
I
sorry.
think right. But I think of myself absolutely as a Southern writer. I think it's I can't even undo that from the idea of myself as a Black woman, queer writer, actually. And I, there is so much richness and texture. There is a kind of a way in which the status of being a Southern Black woman, right? Who is sort of watching the rest of the world assume and think all of these things, right?
Mhm.
And sort of project. That's sort of how I see it. That then you have all these people who have a sense that they're somehow different or somehow better, even though, right, you have recorded for the nation in a kind of grueling way all of its trespasses and all of its sort of things that it doesn't want to deal with, that you hold it, you are holding it, while this other part of the nation projects onto you some kind of, in a kind of infantilizing way.
Mm-hmm.
And I think of that as not indistinct from the thing my grandmother had and my mother had, which is this deep sort of sense. And this woman in Burundi who I loved so much, who's no longer with us, but her name was Clemence Mpozinzi. And she renamed herself after the genocide in Burundi. And she called herself, the translation of her name is, I know, but I won't say. Okay. And and that's sort of like a vague English translation. And I'm always struck by that. And that's sort of a way in which I think of my own self and all the Black Southern people I know, and our sort of positioning, knowing so much, not always saying. And I think beyond that, not always being heard from, and knowing that we are wasting our breath and we're just too tired sometimes to actually say, right? And so I feel very proud of it. And I think of myself, I think it's okay too to be able to say I think of the global South, and I'm interested in being in the world and still being Southern and Black and woman and gay and all of those beautiful things.
Um, so apologies if there has been an announcement and I missed it. Um, but like I feel like this book just screams to be translated to the screen. Are there any plans for that? Would you like to see that?
I don't know about plans because I've released it to my people, my agents, and all of them. But I have to be honest, for a long time, I was completely against it because I just felt too close to the whole thing. And then I realized that I could let it go, that I could actually, and maybe living with a filmmaker has helped me in a way, realize that a film is not a book. A film can never be a book, right? That you have to literally think of it as a thing completely separate from you, that it has nothing on earth to do with you. Of course, this is my D says that it's harder because it's nonfiction, right? And so there's this way that I know these people and I'm more protective of them. And I think that's what I've been holding on to, this protectiveness of, because I know how I treated my family and how the care I took. Even if other people think it's very exposing, I know the care I took, right? And so that I can't guarantee that care is hard, I think, for me. But I'm letting it go bit by bit, So my people are, I think, very eager for me to let it go a lot more than I let go, because I think there is a lot of interest for it.
Would you feel better if Dee was the one directing?
We've talked about that. And I said, at first I said I only wanted Dee to direct it. And she said, maybe if you write it. And I think what's tricky for her, because we're like, we want to stay together. Okay. We don't want
Right.
to blow out over her version of, she's like, I don't want to like have some woman in there being Ivory May. And you're like, what the hell? So, we decided that we didn't want to risk putting our relationship, which I think we have a great one, at stake because of a film. It just felt sort of ridiculous. But I think now I think we feel like, well, maybe we just want to see how it plays out. But I'd rather not. I'd rather not have this sort of strange,
Yeah.
like my partner's casting me. I mean, come on, it can't get strange. I mean,
Oh man.
every choice I'll be like, oh, that's how you imagine me to be?
Yeah. Right. Yeah, especially when we're thinking about essence.
Exactly.
Right. Oh my goodness. Um, well, like this has just been like a dream conversation for me.
God bless
Um,
you.
is there anything else that you would like to add that I may have missed?
Anything that I would like to add? No, I think, I guess we'll say something about, because you mentioned water, and my idea of
Mm,
water. And I think for me, it was so important to wrest back this idea of what Katrina was and wasn't, and to pay particular attentions to the ways in which official negligence contributed to this disaster, right? That not all natural events are, in fact, needed. They don't have to become disasters.
mhm,
And there were so many systemic failures here that led to the catastrophe most of us refer to as Katrina. And also to personify the moment with water and to say all of us are in the path of something, some form of water that can overwhelm us, exceed us, that is beyond what in our human capacities we can avoid. And the question is always up to us. Now what? Right? And I think we see that now with climate change. We certainly see it with COVID.
mhm.
Um, and our response to COVID, which one can argue, is literally the official negligence that has led us to this moment. So I think it's shocking to keep remembering how that water, that capital W water, actually has become this sort of overwhelming power and force, and how every single time, if we look at the official negligence, we start to see it could have been different. It didn't have to be this way. That's all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much,
Um,
Mariah. Thank you.
and I just want to say, I know there's a storm coming. Please be safe.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I will do my absolute best.
And on behalf of the Mayborn Conference, I think this is the point where I say that if you have questions for Sarah, you can submit them. Um, and I think Neil will sort of coordinate how that's going to work. But again, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks, Sarah.